welcome to Mastery TV. It's going to be our effort to pull back the curtain a bit about the Mastery School and to dig into issues about teaching, learning, and the way we're going to go forward. So this is our first episode, and it seems appropriate and fantastic that we have our first two guests as Scott Looney is the head of Hawken and Julia Griffin, who is the director of the Mastery School of Hawken. So welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, it's a high budget affair here. Got my dog Sophie and
the whole team.
The whole team here, an elaborate studio. So, but anyway, let's just talk about school. Let's start at square one. So this is the title of this episode is Mastery 101. So we're gonna get the basics. So I guess the first question is, what is mastery learning, and how is it different from what we call the traditional approach? And if it's so great, why do we need to do it? So Scott, why don't you tackle the beginning here?
Sure. Mastery learning kind of conceptually is pretty simple to understand. In terms of executing it well, it's anything but simple. The idea of mastery is that you should continue to learn something until, wait for it, you've mastered it to a certain level. And that sounds simple, and people go, well, of course, isn't that what school does? No, it actually isn't what school does. At the end of the week, at the end of the unit, at the end of the quarter, at the end of the, you're done. We take a snapshot of your learning called grades, and you move on, whether you were done or not. Conversely, if you mastered this, but the rest of the class didn't, you just sit there and keep doing the same exercises over and over and over again, even though you've mastered it, because the whole class isn't ready. The current model is built literally in the image of industrial production. It's built like a factory assembly line. If you happen to be the product that's in the middle of the bell curve, it sort of works out for you. If you need a little bit more time, or you really want to move on to something more interesting or deeper, you can't. So the biggest thing to know about mastery is that the way the program is described, it allows for the flexibility of time. And the second is pathway, right? The idea that we should all master the same thing is kind of an old construct. Now, there are minimal skills we all need to have. We should be able to write really well and think really clearly and partner really well, right? But do we really need to necessarily have exactly the same set of experiences for 4 years in high school? I think there's a lot of evidence we know there's a lot of evidence that no, that's not. We have different passions, we have different capacities, we have different strengths and weaknesses. And so we think you should take different paths in order to play to your strengths, shore up your weaknesses, and wait for it. Have room to find your own specific kind of passion. In a mastery-based system, you can do those things. In a factory assembly line system, you eat the meal that was served you, whether it's your flavor or not, and you have to eat it at the pace that the chef tells you you have to dine. And for some kids, that's great. I like that meal, and that feels like the right pace. But for many kids, not so much.
All right. So just a quick follow-up, is there something about this moment in time that makes it feel like this is the right, we're reading the moment? Is there something about mastery learning and being alive at this time?
I think there's a couple things that make this the time. One is that prior to a fully connected world where you can get all of the knowledge of human experience at your fingertips, you kind of had to have a library in your head. You had to have the equivalent of as much knowledge as humanly possible, so you didn't have to either run to an expert, which would be really inconvenient, or a library. But now that I can ask Siri a whole bunch of stuff that I don't have to memorize, there might be room for other things. That's actually not the most important reason. The most important reason is that the byproducts of the industrial production model of education are going on in the world. And what the world is saying is, you're not ready. You don't have the skills necessary to be successful. You don't know how to collaborate. You don't know how to be creative. You don't know how to think through critical issues. You don't know how to persist through failure. You're pretty good at filling out multiple choice tests, and you're pretty good at writing papers that have a common 5-paragraph theme. I'm an employer that I don't really need that, but thanks. School as it's currently constructed is increasingly clearly not actually preparing kids for the variety of things they need to be good at in the future. And so, and this isn't an opinion. If you ask, there was a survey done by IBM, 1,200 CEOs of various types of corporations, for-profit and nonprofit, saying, what do you need from your workforce? the 6 of the top 8 things are in the categories that are called soft skills. Can you collaborate? Can you communicate? Can you work well with others? Are you willing to persist? It wasn't writing, numeracy. Now there were a few of those in there, and those are essential. But school's a little bit too focused on concrete content, and not how do you apply it in the real world? What do you actually do with geometry? What do you actually do with a certain kind of writing? What do you actually do with and so connecting learning to the real world is another core component of a mastery education, is returning it back to its original home, because it turns out not only does that help produce useful people, but it's a lot more interesting. But learning becomes kind of fascinating again when you connect it back to why it matters.
Yeah. Well, let's get into some specifics. Julia, you're doing it now. Mastery School opened in August. We're a couple months in. What does it look like? What does it look like at the Mastery School of Hawken? Can you give us a sense of how this might feel and different than what you might get in a traditional school?
Yeah, absolutely. How is the operative word, because those goals that and those reasons that Scott just described, more and more, that's what all educators agree on, that we have this different set of goals for students than what high school was like when I was in high school. But then how you do it, like that's really that's where the magic happens at the Mastery School, and that's a big part of what does look really different from a traditional school. So instead of using what are basically very outdated containers of saying there are going to be these 50 minutes in the day where you think about math and then you stop, and these 50 minutes where you think about English and then you stop, and we'll use the equal amount of time for each of these things that have nothing to do with each other. We've organized our time and our program really differently to allow for the kind of depth and the kind of skill development that Scott was talking about. So the major program elements that a student in the Mastery School engages in as their learning experiences are 3: macros, micros, and intensives. Macros, I'll start there. Macros are the biggest portion of a student's schedule. And in a macro, students learn while working on a challenge with a community partner that is real and urgent for that partner or organization. They work on teams. And for the space of 3 or 4 weeks, their job is to come up with as good a solution as possible to this challenge and present it back to the person who gave the challenge to them. And so we do it this way because real complex problems are the best learning terrain for giving humans the opportunity to learn content and skills, new hard things that they didn't know before. It also speaks to everything Scott was saying about CEOs and folks out in the real world who want people who can come in and tackle a complex problem where there's no clear starting place and no single right answer. And school is singularly bad at preparing students for that. So in a macro, students get multiple opportunities to encounter a new problem, break it down, understand it, work with a team who have different perspectives on it than they do, and start to realize and value that actually that diversity of perspectives is a strength. And that's what's going to get them to a better solution than any single person sitting by themselves in a room would come up with. And the learning terrain in those challenges can be widely varied. You could be working with an architect and designing a new room for a house that has to meet certain historic standards, and you have to really understand the neighborhood, and you also have to really understand the structural systems of architecture and how you're going to build that room safely. Or you might be working on how to make water equity happen in Cleveland, and what does it take? What are the barriers to making water affordable and accessible, clean water for people throughout Cleveland? So the learning terrain can really be anything, but those skills that students work on and develop in the macros are common, and then they start to, it's incredible the iterative growth that they experience. Second program element is micros, and really in micros, that's where a lot of the personalization that Scott was talking about before takes place. So in micros, which are small individual or small group projects that students work on over the course of their time at the Mastery School, students get to work on things that they need to work on. So maybe there's something that they're working on a challenge in their micro and they realize that actually they need a lot more practice with writing, and the macro is moving on to its next challenge, but the student can go into a writing boot camp micro and get some really sustained practice that helps them build that skill in a big way. Or it might be that they start doing something in their macro and they really love it and they want to do more. And so then again, they can then be in, time to go be working in the Fab Lab and building things and doing some 3D modeling that speaks to something that's a real passion of theirs, something that they want to do more. And that could be a pre-existing passion before they got here, or something they discover along the way. And then we say, great, let's do more of that. Here we go. So that's micros. And then intensives are the third major program element. And in intensives, students at the Mastery School and students at the upper school together get to engage in 3-week experiences where students and teachers do one thing. They take one class all day, every day. And so in that time and space, there's the opportunity to really design the whole arc of time without any interference or anything that gets in the way of that learning experience. Some of it could happen on campus. It could all happen off campus. And students will routinely talk about the community building that happens within that intensive, and also just the depth of learning that they get from only having that opportunity to concentrate on one thing.
Yeah. So there are these 3 elements. So if for families or people who don't understand or have never encountered this, the macro, the micro, the intensive are the major program elements, for mastery learning, and they, take up the most of the time. But there's also this this emphasis at the Mastery School about personal journeys and self-awareness and reflection and a lot of what Scott was talking about. And I know that's the Wayfinding class or Wayfinding program. So can you talk a little bit about Wayfinding and how that actually fits in with these other program elements?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Wayfinding in a lot of ways is right at the core of everything, because it's where students actually get to integrate all the different kinds of things that they're learning about themselves as they engage in these learning experiences, and have the opportunity and support to process what that means for them and help figure out what they want to do next. So we know that students need a sense of belonging in order to feel safe enough to take risks and learn. And so the Wayfinding space provides students with a group of fellow students and a mentor with whom they meet regularly, once a week, usually in the group, and then once a week for a one-on-one check-in with their mentor. And so that sustained relationship over time then allows the mentor to really get to know the student very well and help them to know, when do they need to stretch themselves a little more? When do they need more support? And helps them to also make sense of what they're learning and think about, what micros should I be trying to work on next? What macro should I take? And what might I want to design for myself? And the Wayfinding mentor is also the person who helps to shepherd the student through the crediting process, which is all about the student pulling together their very best work that they can then present for review and to earn the mastery credits that are ultimately going to be the reflection of everything that they've learned that they then can share with colleges. So, Wayfinding is really at that core, and along the way in that process of discovery that students go on, we also see them start to develop a real sense of purpose and what is it that matters to me, and how can some of these things that matter to me, how can I use those things and use my strengths to make some kind of difference in the world. So yeah, that's Wayfinding.
It's an incredible idea that part of your education is the self-awareness to sort of guide it, and that really is a distinction in the Mastery School. So we'll have to have another episode on the Mastery transcript, which you allude to. So that's another major shift. That's maybe Mastery 102 or 201 or whatever. I'm sure about that. So we'll do that. We'll do that soon. Okay. Well, Scott, I'm curious from your perspective. It's a major shift in education. What's the response been like? From parents, from educators? I mean, what's your sense of how this is landing in the education world?
Sure. So I'm going to agree with you and then correct you. First of all, mastery learning is the oldest form of education. All mammals in the world prior to about 140 years ago, including humans, learned everything this way. We are pre-programmed to learn through experience, learn to go out into the world and try to fix something, solve something, make something better mostly with other people. And along the way, by working on it until we're good at it, mastering it, usually in proximity to somebody who has more experience. And we call them teachers now. They used to be called coaches, guides, mentors. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution when we decided to systematize things and standardize things that we put kids on an assembly line. Took us 100 and some years to figure out that that's probably not a great model. So maybe we should go back to the way nature designed all sentient beings on this planet to operate, which is to go out in the world and do things and learn from that with the guidance of someone who knows some things. So in terms of the education world, the mastery movement isn't new. The research that supports it really took off in the 70s and 80s. And it really got reinforced through science when we could look inside the human brain in the early 80s, when we can literally see a brain while it's thinking. We realize, the brain's actually not doing all the things we thought it was doing the way we thought it was doing. Turns out that the emotional center of the brain is an essential component to learning. Used to think that it was just the frontal lobe, the kind of higher order, that's all you really use. Turns out that if you don't trigger the emotions of people while they learn, they can only retain what they're learning for just a little while, unless you just do it through muscle memory, so make them do it over and over and over again. So there's two ways to learn stuff and be able to remember it later. One is just muscle memory, and the industrial production model privileges that. Unfortunately, it makes learning terrible and boring and painful. Or we can make it interesting, engaging, exciting, confusing, frustrating, curious, the way the real world tends to do anyway, in which case those emotions become wonderful opportunities to inculcate something for a very long time. And I use an example. I asked parents, I said, think about the worst thing that ever happened to you when you were a student in school. Every hand goes up. I say, can you remember it clearly, like it happened yesterday? Yeah, because your emotions were triggered. Well, you can organize school so that you can trigger emotions, only this time they're really positive. And it turns out taking kids out in the world and solving problems that help other human beings, if you actually get it right, you can actually help somebody, triggers an extraordinary array of both useful negative emotions, frustration because you never get it right the first time, to elation when you finally get it right and you can present to somebody something that matters. And when you realize you matter, not that the project mattered, that you matter to the project and the project matters to somebody else, a sense of purpose starts to develop. And purposeful people are resilient, hardworking, can manage all sorts of things. People who are just checking boxes on a game that's organized like a machine just get good at the game. And fundamentally, that's the difference between mastery learning and the industrial production model. And Hawken's not alone. There are schools all over the world that are doing this. We're part of a group called the Mastery Transcript Consortium. We'll have another show on that, which is public and private schools from all over the world that are trying to do this. Along the way, that means having kids be judged by the quality of their work that's unique to them on a pace that's unique to them, not grades, not courses at the end of semesters. And that's a very big structural change. And there's a movement that's happening. And the colleges are accepting it as absolutely equivalent. And we're thrilled to see that. So this is coming, and it's going to be a lot faster than the traditional educational model is probably ready for. But there's a lot of energy and a lot of really extraordinary schools, not just Hawken, they're trying to do this work.
Yeah. And, so we're 4 months in, or what are we, 3 months in? How long's it been since we started? But, we've got the first class of Mastery School students, and they seem to be having the exact experience, right? Elation, frustration, engagement. But whenever I'm down there, they seem to be having a very good time and seem to be really loving it. So that's the hope. So anyway, thank you guys for joining on the very first episode of Mastery TV. We'll see how long we can get a run. Maybe we'll get into syndication, make a lot of money, and change careers halfway through.
I hope the audience finds this more interesting than your dog did.
No,
so that's all I have to say.
This is that is par for the course. All right, so thank you, Scott. Thank you, Julia, for joining, and we'll be back soon.